Facebook doesn't sell your data, but Facebook is selling the identity graph, right? It knows you and the world around you, and it's selling that value.
Amit Pradhan, a seasoned startup founder, investor, and speaker.
Amazon is selling products based upon your patterns and the patterns of your buying habits and people around you, right? And then if you think about a world where we're getting into deep personalization, selling better is coming from, knowing your life better. By the way, that's not all bad, right? Like, so many of us want to enable business models based on selling better, sell me value that I'm more interested in. But if you're doing it at the cost of my privacy and you're doing it at the cost of what should be value that I get, then we're violating fundamental principles of who generated that data, for instance, and who benefited the most from it.
All right. Hello, Amit. Nice to meet you. So glad to have you. So glad that our mutual friend, Nick, introduced us. And we're really excited to have you. You've been working on some really, really interesting stuff. And I think that with my background in engineering, Michael's background in cybersecurity, we're going to have a really great convo. And you've been working on, so you are the founder and CEO of Rainfall. You're also the founder and president of the Silicon Valley Blockchain Association. You are the chairman of Zero Labs. You're also the managing general partner of Jet Ventures. And I would love if you could share what piqued your interest in this industry, in this field, and got you started.
Yeah, well, lovely to meet you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. Grateful to Nick for connecting all of us. And it's amazing how much common DNA we have in terms of the mission and the purpose and also, largely the mechanisms and pathways to get to fulfilling mission and purpose. I've been involved in the world of deep tech for about 25 years now, background in AI, and been an entrepreneur and investor for this entire period. Did my first startup while I was still living in Sydney. Fabulous city, by the way, as we were talking about, amazing cities. And we got acquired by a company in California, moved over. The whole, you've heard this and seen this cycle before, entrepreneurs coming from other parts of the world and then getting sucked into this, incredible tech entrepreneur cycle, if you may. And initially, I was sucked in the same way that you'd expect someone in Silicon Valley to be sucked in, and realized very quickly that neither my purpose nor mission were aligning with the idea of tech for the sake of cool tech. And about 18 and a half years ago, my co-founder Rajesh also happens to be my older brother, and somehow we managed to do our startups together, and both are still alive. So it's quite a miracle. And we created both of us with backgrounds in AI. He's far deeper. He's always remained deeply technical. And as we kind of looked at where the trajectory of AI could lead, we realized that aside from all of the dystopian viewpoints of AI that oftentimes you get from, Hollywood AI, and if you asked, pre-ChatGPT, if you asked the average person what they thought about AI, they would quote one of 4 or 5 movies that they watched, starting with Terminator, leading up to, Her and Blade Runner. And our view always was that if you stepped away from that dystopian view of all of the gains and upsides that we would see, the biggest victim, if you may, or the downside would end up being privacy, just because of the computer science approach to AI. And we built the what is effectively the world's first privacy-focused cognitive AI lab in the world in San Francisco called Zero. And our focus was, can we deliver on the promise of AI without violating fundamental principles of privacy, specifically for the consumer? And that was kind of this interesting journey of we started down a neuroscience approach rather than a computer science approach. And most of our work for the first 4 or 5 years in that lab was entirely focused on understanding the cortical structure of the human brain, specifically towards interactions. Because at the end of the day, what we learned and built upon was that the brain is the ultimate multi-sensory recognition neural net. And because privacy was our focus, we used a lot of biomimicry of the way that the human world works. We have, in many ways, we all have our individual brains. And while we might share, as three of us are doing here today, we might share and we come together in active context. We still remain three independent brains and then move on and do what we do. And the world of AI was all focused on kind of, if you get it right, you create the one super brain, right? And the super brain is, I always say, think of it as a brain that is beige. It has taken, 50 years of global north data across 6 billion connected humans, and then our interactions with business and public and government, and created this one super brain. But it's synthesizing across all of these different colors and created this one neutral beige brain. It has biases, of course, because it's 50 years of global north data. But also it is sort of like this, knows everything about everything, but nothing just deeply specific about anyone. Just enough to violate privacy, not bake in provenance, right? But not enough to replicate the way that actually the human condition in the world that we live in works. And so that was our path into like solving for that challenge, and how I built around this idea of self-sovereignty. If we focus on self-sovereignty in data, if we focus on self-sovereignty in terms of freedom, then if you would ask this question, who owns you? Especially to the average American today, it's a visceral response. We fought our biggest war within America on that very question, and yet the cognitive representation of each one of us increasingly is being captured, contextualized, and owned by a handful of companies. I like to say 5 guys, right? 3 in Silicon Valley, 2 in Seattle, and unbeknownst to us, we now have representations of ourselves being used in transactions, being used to enhance business without having the control over it, right? And there, of course, we align so deeply on those core principles. And so the idea of self-sovereignty, the idea of decentralization was sort of core to us for many years. I got involved early into the world of crypto. That kind of then led into how do we bring long-term thoughtful capital into the space? Because again, so important to have these different pillars. You can have good intention and, all of us, thinking about privacy and self-sovereignty and building for that. But then you're driven by capital structures. It's impossible, unless you're sitting on, billions of dollars yourself. It's very difficult to build anything without, having capital come and join in. So you need those capital structures to be aligned, right? And then you can't build without community. You can't build without being compliant with regulations. So you need all of these different pillars. And my approach was, how do we get to those pillars? And so the idea was bring in capital that is more aligned to a long-term view of a decentralized society. And that gave birth to the Silicon Valley Blockchain Society initiative. We brought the world's first institutional capital into the space, pension funds, that would not have imagined investing in digital assets or decentralization. And with the fund, with Jet Ventures, the idea was, how do you fulfill on that promise? Like, my purpose as a human is to invest, create, and influence in people and projects that create a net positive impact on the humans they intend to serve. And one of the pillars of that is capital. And so, the idea was, how do we leverage the networks to start bringing capital in? And so that's kind of the journey of how, we came to this point of Rainfall and, having this vision of creating 6 billion self-sovereign personal AIs for every connected human, and then eventually adding 2 billion connected humans, all to tie into the mission, which is to create a daily sustainable income from what is a fundamental human right. I know we all align on that principle, which is data. And if humans can have control, agency, and self-sovereignty over that data, then its sensible, responsible abstraction can fulfill that mission of creating a daily sustainable income for the next billion connected humans. That's kind of long answer, but that's how, kind of the journey brought me here.
Right. And one of the foundational observations here is that this society has this deep and rich foundation in liberty. But when you speak of self-ownership, certainly as I look out across the United States and broadly the West, I would say that the idea of radical self-ownership is certainly core to libertarianism, and libertarianism is niche. It is not the dominant political ideology in the United States or in any Western country, with the possible exception of Malay winning in Argentina. Certainly, libertarians are overrepresented in crypto, and when you look at that kind of foundational political thinking, there's a lot of negative liberty. It's freedom from tyranny, but you're trying to create practical benefit. So, link for us how these notions of extraordinary sovereignty lead to new abilities, new capabilities, like life benefits apart from just fear of tyranny.
I mean, and I love that point, Michael, because I think if you spend a lot of time in the world of crypto, where you have that absolute libertarianism, freedom, and freedom from tyranny in those conversations, I would say there are some who hold true to those beliefs, and I think the rest is a lot of opportunism. And having lived in that world for a while, it's like no centralized control. It's like we have to fight these systems. So I'm going to create a replacement system that I control that is much better because I believe in freedom and I'm the good guy, right? And this is the challenge. Like if you unpack what that freedom actually means, most of the time it means economic freedom. And if you think about what most of that world is fighting for, that I've been a part of for a long time, is economic freedom. And I think that it's such a difficult interplay between economic freedom and let me get as much maximum upside because I found this new tool to economic freedom first. And you look at the history, right? And it's always been that. I think the unlocking the true power and the true potential of self-sovereignty is understanding that self-sovereignty brings with it incredible rights and deep responsibility. And I think that's the big difference. If you think of self-sovereignty as incredible rights, I can do what I want without being in the construct of this world and society we live in, versus the idea of I have more freedom and I have some of the liberties that otherwise get taken away from me, not by government, but by the dominant structures that have come before. There's a deep difference between that. And to me, I would say, if you just apply it within the tech world and specifically around data and AI, that freedom is freedom of identity, right? So if you think about fundamental principles of self-sovereign ID, do I own my identity, or does Facebook own and monetize the identity graph, right? And you think about that in terms of what does that identity and the context around it become, and how is it used, and who gets to use it? We don't have that control. That control lives with the deep centralized tech forces, right? If that results in monetary value, which, as we know, across big tech, it's not like big tech is selling data. That's kind of a, it's a very basic argument to have. But what they're doing is they're selling business models from that data, and those business models accrue trillions of dollars of revenue, more than the GDP of Germany, right? And the idea that is accruing literally to a handful of companies and people, that is where we need to to change that model. And that's where aspects of freedom and self-sovereignty come in on the monetization side. But it doesn't mean that we can have like absolute anarchy and you can create this new island that has no laws and it doesn't come under any structures of, the US or Europe or anything like that.
Could I also, just for the listeners that are tuning in, could you explain a little bit about these business models? Because a lot of times people are taught that it's just the selling of the data that is occurring.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, if you just take a few examples, Facebook doesn't sell your data. I would say Cambridge Analytica was a little bit of an exception, right? Where some of that data was sold as is. But Facebook is selling the identity graph, right? It knows you and the world around you, and it's selling that value in terms of, advertisers. Amazon is selling products based upon your patterns and the patterns of your buying habits and people around you, right? Google is selling AdWords largely, aside from the other businesses, and that's coming from the contextualization of data. And then if you think about a world where we're getting into deep personalization, selling better is coming from, knowing your life better, right? And by the way, that's not all bad, right? Like so many of us want to enable business models based on selling better, sell me value that I'm more interested in. But if you're doing it at the cost of my privacy and you're doing it at the cost of what should be value that I get, then we're violating fundamental principles of who generated that data, for instance, and who benefited the most from it, right? I don't think anyone here is opposed to the idea of businesses having business models and businesses making money and creating value. That's the whole point. It's, under what premise do you do it? Do you violate some fundamental principles of privacy? Do you not have fair distribution of where value is generated, not just fair distribution for the sake of fair distribution, right? And, one of the things I always look at, so I sit on the Global Mobility Council of BMW. And, thinking about future of responsible mobility, I also sit on the board of the Norwegian Refugee Council. The NRC, as it's called, is the frontier refugee agency in the world today because it has the highest governance rating. And, the way I like to think of the use of technology in anything that we build or even invest in, do you fulfill the true potential for Susan, the mother of two, who drives a $150,000 electric German car or American car, and equally, can you benefit Rashida, the refugee mom of two who lives in one of our camps at the border of Turkey and Syria? And, when you start thinking about the implications of privacy and how we unlock the value of that data, for Susan, she's a mom, she has two kids, privacy perhaps matters. But honestly, in this world of convenience, privacy doesn't take kind of the biggest priority. But Rashida is in those camps because she has escaped a genocidal regime and a regime that might still be targeting her. And so there is just no way that data can reveal where she's at, because that could have implications to her life and life of the other people there. And suddenly that same context and concept of privacy has far greater meaning, even when you want to leverage it from a business model perspective, than when we just think about like, hey, does someone know I'm in Brooklyn or not? And what are the implications of that, right?
How could we redesign AI business models to ensure that the value creation is more equally distributed between corporations and individual users?
I love that question. It's a hybrid approach to it, right? On one hand, we need AI to be self-sovereign in that it represents you and I and Rashida. We have the choice and control of what happens with the contextualization of our data using that AI. We should ideally have the ability to control where that AI resides and most importantly, that AI belongs to me, because I am self-sovereign. Why does the AI that represent me not be sovereign to me? But at the same time, it is silly to think that there won't be centralized AI that fulfills huge enterprise use cases. And I think that the approach is a hybrid approach where the abstracted models from personal AIs can now work with the centralized AI models that fulfill a very specific use case for businesses, and that they can do it without revealing the PII, the personally identifiable information that is embedded in the data that effectively train our individual AI models. And then when you think about what is the responsible use of that centralized AI, and we're seeing it today with whether it's ChatGPT or any of the other just LLMs, and we're not even talking about the other platform AIs, there are huge issues around privacy and provenance, right? And there are new regulatory frameworks that are starting to roll out around provenance, where these LLMs, as they train on new data, are going to have to prove where the data came from, make sure there was no infringement of any rights. And then, of course, there's, as I think it was Perplexity, right, that just proposed a new model with publishers where, they're willing to have the publishers share in the revenue model. And that's coming. And I often say that's coming because of two vectors: the school of public opinion, conversations like we're having around, owning your data, self-sovereignty rights, etc., and then regulatory frameworks. And the regulatory frameworks, of course, are going to lead from Europe because they obviously have more of a DNA towards privacy. But we're not far behind in the US. And actually, the AI framework recommendations that have come from the Biden-Harris administration, and they will only increase, already start addressing some of the issues around future of AI that we've all been talking about actually for the past many years. So it's that responsible combination model. Our approach is we think big AI, big tech, and more importantly, the enterprises that benefit from that should continue to benefit from it. I think we're very aligned on that principle. Like, let's create more value. Let's create more hyper-personalization. Let's make sure that the value is much better for the individual than just a generic ad or offer. But let's do it in a responsible way. And so if you can protect privacy, if you can give choice to that user, therefore agency and control, and in all of that, if you can create, fair value exchange, then I think we're going in the right direction. We're truly unlocking the power and promise of AI.
Like, thinking about why the concept of ownership exists. Well, one of my ideas is that ownership as a cognitive tool, as a sort of social technology, solves for tragedy of the commons problems. Ideally, what you want is for people to face accountability for their decisions. And like, broadly speaking, I think that like power and consequences, like power and accountability for outcomes, should just roughly rise in lockstep. And like ownership is one of the tools that tries to bring about that pairing. And I was thinking as you were describing the monetization of social graph knowledge, that a company like Facebook isn't, of course, selling the intelligence, right? They're not selling the social graph. They're in a sense selling access to superior message routing that is facilitated by having this extraordinary social graph. By message routing, that you can think of an ad as being worthless if it's served to someone who's not interested, as being possibly extraordinarily beneficial to two parties, the inventor or seller of a thing and the person who could benefit from that thing, right? So we all want efficient message routing. If I am an inventor or provider of a good or a service, maybe it's not for everyone. So it's nice to be able to appeal to Facebook and say, help me find the people who actually care about my thing, right? So here we are. That it turns out like trillions of dollars, as you pointed out, can transact because of that message broker in the middle who's like, I'm very, very good at connecting these two parties. which seems socially beneficial. And so importantly, Facebook is the owner of this knowledge, like the owner of this social graph knowledge. And that knowledge can degrade if it was in the public domain, because then we would have a tragedy of the commons problem, and people would just try to maximize their benefit of this thing while absolutely minimizing their contribution to it. So sometimes it's actually kind of nice for there to be, some. I guess the picture that I'm painting is almost a benevolent, monopolist or near monopolist, like someone who has the thing, wants the thing to last for a long time for literally ultimate social benefit, and therefore is going to ensure that no one gets to make a copy. They only get to access it in these small ways in order to make the beneficial thing happen. And literally the world of all blockchains is about how do we get to consensus without a benevolent monopolist, right? But we also don't want tragedy of the commons. So how do we transfer enough of how do we make this distributed intelligence that nonetheless it doesn't just become a commons that gets destroyed, right? Like what is the mechanism that creates a virtuous circle versus death spiral?
Yeah. So I think the simplest way to think of the challenge that exists, let's say, in the decentralized world purely from a blockchain perspective is, we've seen now about 7 years of blockchain-based data marketplaces, right? And the problem with, and none of them have worked, right? And the ugly truth is that raw data has no value, right? It's only when it's contextualized, when it's aggregated. And to your point of that centralized party, it's not who controls it. It's also not important whose economics they are. What's important about that interested centralized party in the example of Facebook is that it is the one that is ensuring the distribution in context, because otherwise, if it is not a contextually relevant business, that even if it's abstracted intelligence, it is useless. Raw data, of course, entirely useless. And then, if there is a non-relevant business that is learning about habits about you without even knowing who you are, that's useless to them, because the offer that they can now make to you for cat food for someone who's allergic to animals is entirely irrelevant, right? And no one wins in that model. And so the trick is, and certainly the approach that we've taken with Rainfall is, what you want to do is you want to have this abstracted intelligence as the first layer, so that you can take raw data, you can create the relevant abstracted intelligence. And that intelligence can sit in a decentralized network. But instead of matching that back down to you with a cat food promotion, what it does is it looks at the participating businesses and says, who here is relevant for this intelligence? Now, that could be a centralized AI play. That could be a large retailer that distributes out to hundreds of thousands of vendors. It could be someone like a MasterCard or a Visa that says, great, like I'm an intelligence platform, but I know the businesses that are relevant. And I have, 1 million vendors, of which 40 are relevant to this context. And you still get back to the same circles. So it's really important the way that you described it. From our perspective, it's about changing the way you think about the construction of that intelligence and the way you think about the economics and provenance of that intelligence. So the construction comes with first principles of privacy and self-sovereignty baked in, and the economics come from fair distribution of value. So if your data generated the intelligence that was then matched as one piece of an aggregation to, a contextually relevant business, what is your share of that revenue in the entire value chain? That completes that whole circle that in the way that you described it, to make it fair, equitable, but also ensure that there's privacy baked in. But it doesn't take away from the idea that this is not just a on-chain collection of intelligence and people can come and grab it as they want because they can. Then you lose that targeting, you lose that specific value, and obviously this is a way for us to solve that.
Right. If there's some way to harness edge intelligence, like if my agents can pull advertising messages towards me when they compute based on private data that I would be interested, then we get the effect of message routing, but instead of the central intelligence knowing which edges to route to, we have edge intelligence pulling messages, which I think I would enjoy.
I agree completely. And I think that the idea that there's so much of edge intelligence that has bidirectional value, right? Like it's that edge intentional that knows what to push up, and equally the edge intentional knows what to pull down. And being able to do that without, in many ways, if you think of zero knowledge proofs, obviously it's a concept that is becoming more popular now. But fundamentally, for people listening who don't know sort of that technical term or the crypto term of zero knowledge proofs, it's just, the best example I like to give is, if you walk into a bar and there's a bouncer at the door, especially in the US, that says, show me your ID. And then they look at the ID and they decide whether you can go in or not. Now, that decision is not based on whether it's a nice photo or whether you're a donor or what your address is or what even your birth date is. It is only based on his or her computation that year of the birth date aggregates to an age above 21. That's all they care about. And yet they're looking at where you live. They're looking at whether you're a donor or not, how tall you are, what the color of your eyes are. Irrelevant, right? So if that driver's license could just go green, when he holds it, it means you can walk in, and it goes red if you can't walk in, right? And so what is the information that he needs? He just needs to know that one piece. Everything else he should have no knowledge about, right? And so it's the same thing with the idea of edge intelligence, Michael, in the way that you described it. Your agent can pull down stuff that is valuable to that edge in the context of that user. And pulling that down doesn't have to reveal in the same way that pushing intelligence up so that it can be aggregated and find the right businesses to push value back down can be done with complete abstraction of, who I am, or the fact that I have 2 kids or I don't have 2 kids, because all you're trying to do is sell me something for my cat. And the fact that I have 2 kids in school is irrelevant, and that they play soccer is entirely irrelevant, right? And I drive them in my white colored car, completely irrelevant, right? And so you can do those things. And to your point, I think the future of edge intelligence is going to become such an integral part of how value is not just delivered, but how value is created.
That reminds me of a conversation I was having with Amna, actually, about like who we are. Is the self an illusion? Are we a unified person? And do we have to be a singular person online? Amna, you can riff on this better than me.
In terms of, being a single unified person online.
Or do we end up with 12 digital selves?
Oh, I think for me, okay, where this is taking me in terms of other conversations we've had, maybe it's the same one, is that whatever our online self is that's presented, right, that's based on our past data, but not necessarily who we are now and what we could become in the future. And that has often been on my mind in conversations about this topic, because as we change, do these models also change and adapt to take that into account? Or is it more that we become more like the predictions of these models because we're being fed this data back in this loop? And are we just kind of stuck in this cycle? And like you mentioned earlier, Amit, if it's just one beige centralized knowledge brain where we're getting everything from, does that influence our behavior and just create a weird cycle?
Right?
Yeah.
And it's such a fascinating point, because you can start getting into the deeper philosophy of who we are. And I would say there's two pieces to this. So one part is that we are obviously a byproduct of our context. And if our context fed to us starts to show us a lot of interesting data about, the Olympics, then, do we start becoming suddenly Olympic fans? This often happens with like teams, right? Like you don't follow, football at all, and then suddenly, the team from your city has made the Super Bowl, and suddenly you're this crazy football fan, right? Like, it's just simple examples of how things that we just haven't been for our entire life, suddenly we are for that moment, right? So to your point, absolutely, we are a byproduct of context, right? But equally, and this is actually a really important part of thinking of who we are, whether we like it or not, unless we are the very rare few who have, disappeared to the Himalayas and, become, monks, we are kindred beings. We are a byproduct of what's around us. We are a byproduct of especially the humans around us. And that's why, if you think about our context is not just the story of our lives, it's the story of the lives of the people around us. And some aspects of those people are static and some aspects are dynamic and changing. And that's why more often than not, if we get into, we're in election season here, so you can imagine, you get into lest you be so bold and brave and you were to get into a political discussion with someone who has a viewpoint different from yours in America right now, of course, what that results in. And we tend to get really deep into our own ideology. And I often say, like, go back 5 years, go back 10 years. Did you actually have the same position? No, like, your positions evolved over time because your context changed and the people around you changed. And that is actually the reality of our lives. And, one of the things we do in Rainfall is, because we've got this unique self-sovereign AI that it lives on each user's device. So it is, Michael, as you were saying, true edge intelligence. And what it's doing is it's building in real time from all of the different data events what we call the kindred bit for each user. It's not just the story of their lives, it's the story of the lives around them that become a part of who you truly are. So when you think of edge intelligence, if you think of our patterns, behaviors, predictions are a byproduct of more than just us. Because, for example, Michael, if you and I were in, or Amna, we went and got lunch in the East Village, the chances that we would go to a place that you recommend are definitely higher than a place that I would recommend, because, you live there and you have a lot of context, even though I might have favorites if you were to come to Zurich or if you were to come to San Francisco, where I've spent most of my life. Our context is driven by the kindred beings that we are. And so if you really wanted to create true value back, whether as a business or as a government or whatever it might be, with all of those first principles of privacy baked in, having the knowledge of my kindred being, and that's kind of what that kindred bit has encapsulated in it, allows for us to create a better identification of the who we are, because the who we are is non-static. And you could answer that question for today and you could say, I support politically this issue or this candidate or whatever it might be. And if you went and lived in Spartanburg, South Carolina for a 3-year stint at, BMW's, plant there, the chances that at the end of the third year you would have the same views are probably, not guaranteed, right?
Yeah.
And data will tell that story, you know?
I always think about, since a lot of times the current applications for AI are used for predictive purposes, is it important that we take this contextual knowledge that's constantly being changed, since the data will be there? How do we apply that to the AI that's going to be making the predictions? Is there a way to do that, combining it with the past and the present to create a more accurate, more value-based prediction?
Yeah, and in many ways, that's largely what our aim is with the Kindred bit, right? The Kindred bit is if you think of just static historical knowledge of someone, a lot of market intelligence, business intelligence is baked around those principles. I know this about you, therefore I can give you, X, Y, or Z. And in many ways, we are what we are because of our past, our present, and are what we think of as the future, which, by the way, oftentimes is not what turns out, right? Like the things that we think we'll be or want to do, and what really happens is, driven by context and macro conditions and the people around us. And if you capture that and make that available in terms of, contextualized intelligence. So maybe I'll use an example because it kind of, unlocks some of the opportunities and the power behind this, and, how you can do it responsibly. So if you go back to that example of Susan, the mother of two, driving this, fancy electric car, already the future of intelligence compared to the analog world of when we got into the car, we got in, we knew where we wanted to go, and we went there. Or we kind of said, oh, I'm running low on gas, I'm going to drive and find the closest gas station and, fill up. In a modern electric, in your app of the car that you bought, it's going to say, hey, Susan, you have 24 miles of range left. Here is the closest charging station. Would you like me to navigate? Right? And if you say, okay, it shows up on your screen. That's awesome. When you get to kind of more of the idea of your kindred intelligence, it now has a deeper understanding of your life and the life around you. So that same example would sound like this, Susan, it's Monday morning, 8 a.m. You have 24 miles of range left. You need about 150 by Friday evening. Your morning is really busy and the charger at the office is 95% full. But when you take your daughter to football practice at 3 p.m., there's a new supercharger half a block away that has very low occupancy at that time. And if you charge for 45 minutes, you will get 180 miles of range. Oh, and by the way, there's a Joe and the Juice attached to the charger that has dairy-free milk options, right? And you can see how it's not one data event that is revealing that. It's not data just from one person. It is that edge intelligence across all of the different contexts that is allowing that to be created. And by the way, this is what Susan will see, but that is not necessarily what the business needs to see. The charging network, the car company, they don't need to know that your daughter's name is Amy and that she's 12 and she plays in this league. And none of those details. That is Michael, to the point you made, where the agent is deciding what it receives and how it makes that available so it can unlock a lot more value. The business just knows that it should be at 3 o'clock. Why it's at 3 o'clock is something that remains within the kindred bit of Susan, which talks back to her and tells her why 3 o'clock. But that's not what the business saw, right? And so you can create this incredible value. And all the while, Susan's wallet, self-sovereign wallet, is earning an income because it's her data that is creating this intelligence. And we call it real-time social intelligence, right? It's not the historical waypoints of data in your life. It is the living, breathing narrative that your abstracted data can tell as a story, not just about your past life, but your present life and your future needs. And so that's how we create the model.
Scenarios like that I've been calling ambient helpfulness, and it is the future that I want to bring about.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, Michael, the challenge here is how do you capture that? How do you capture that data to be able to create that abstraction, right? And I think that this is one of the big challenges, and in many ways, kind of the mission that you all are on to solve for that is many people think of it, most of our challenges in transportation, for example, I'm obviously involved in that world. We always think of the last mile, right? And in many ways, like, you've got this really cool approach to solving the first mile problem, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I've even joked that it's the last meter observability problem. To get to ambient helpfulness, we need to increase the observability about what's going on with you right now and what is your intent. So situational awareness plus goal is what can unlock this new form almost of helpfulness engineering that we can build in on the edges instead of building anthropomorphic helpful robots. Actually, what I want is this ambient helpfulness, like the built world should be imbuable, or in some way we should be able to add a kind of lens of intent so that the built world literally helps us get where we're going, if you will.
I love that. And the idea of that, the ambient intelligence or the ambient knowledge. And then if you think of it on the other side, on the side of, let's say, the business in this example, in many ways, the way businesses look at data is they go, answer this question for me. How many people are, talking about electric cars in this zip code or at this time or whatever it might be, or how many people with this demographic, etc. And the answer to that we call guided intelligence, right? But it's even more interesting when what is the data telling me that I'm not asking it, right? And we call that emergent intelligence. And I think it's a combination of emergent intelligence on the business side that enables the delivery of, ambient knowledge for the user, because that's kind of, the two sides of that same equation, right? So I love that term. It's really powerful.
Well, thank you so much for being such a great guest, Amit. This has been such an amazing conversation between all three of us. Where can our followers follow you?
Yeah, so on Twitter, I'm at Amitto, Amitto, and LinkedIn is just my full name, Amit Pradhan. And then for stuff that we're doing with Rainfall, it's just rainfall.one.one. And then it's rainfall_1 on Twitter. So that's where all of this, some of the information around what we're doing lives. But it's been so fun. I'd love to, I have a favorite quote which kind of ties into that question both Michael, you and Amna were talking through, which is, who are we? And our past, our present, our future, and like the ideas of the kindred bit, which encapsulate the fact that we're kindred beings. My favorite quote is it's by Ram Dass. At the end of the day, we're just walking each other home. And that's such a powerful sentiment of the fact that while we are individuals, we are kindred beings, and we're walking each other home. And in those underlying principles and philosophies, what we can unlock for what is now becoming the foundational model for the future can be done in this beautiful, powerful, responsible way. And, I love, obviously, your mission and what you're building to enable that to happen, and how well, philosophically we all align to make that happen.
I love that.
Well, thank you very much. Love being here.